אחים, אחים אהובים, ואני ליטבק, אני חסיד, ואני ברסלב, אני ספרדי, אבל כולנו בני המלך, כולם אחים, אחים אהובים. אוי 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 אוי, הנה מצוין, אוי ומנועים, אוי 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 אוי, שבס אחים, יום יבוכן, אוי 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 אוי, הנה מצוין, אוי ומנועים, אוי 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 אוי, שבס אחים,
Yay, yay, yay. Such a pretty song. That's Joey Newcomb singing his song, B'nai Melech. We are all children of the King. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get it going on a nice Tuesday night? Just a few days to go until Shabbos and Pesach. I don't know what's going on at your house, but we are up to our necks in Passover preparation, which is to say Nina is up to her neck. I mean, the kids and I are helping, but she is a hero. Wow. She's got so much to figure out. It's especially complicated this year with Passover starting right as Shabbos is finishing, and you can't do anything on Shabbos to prepare for that Seder and festive meal that you're going to be serving Saturday night. So all manner of complications there. And we spent some time during our journey through Pesachim studying what goes on when Passover begins right after Shabbos. We don't have the complications of being in Jerusalem and figuring out which, we know we can slaughter the Passover lamb on Saturday afternoon because they always slaughter in the afternoon before Passover. And so even though slaughtering an animal is prohibited on Shabbos, you can do it when Passover starts Saturday night. But as we saw, you can't bring the knife. Eliezer said yes, Akiva said no. All those kinds of debates. The modern version of them is going on now. Do you use a hot plate? Do you keep a burner going? What do you do with the cooking? How do you make it warm? How early can we start the Seder after nightfall? Etc., etc., etc. So big kudos to Nina and everybody who's preparing the festive meal on this very challenging 3-day holiday that starts Shabbos and then 2 days of Passover. Okay, who's with us tonight? Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck Yehudit in South Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Gail in Virginia, Bill in Berkeley, Ann in Merced, Paul in Chicago, Tom in Pennsylvania, Sharon in New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, Renee in Indy, excited she got her first vaccination shot and feeling fine, and may you stay fine. John in Sedona, Patrice in Idaho, Elvis in upstate New York. Tom had his first dose of Pfizer. Beautiful. PK wishing us hello from Colorado, close to Denver. My cousins, thank God, everybody okay in Boulder. But I mean, no words. No words. May the day come soon when such tragedies are no more. Maria is curious about today's title. She says, I usually get an A+ in procrastination. Me too. The procrastination we're referring to in the title actually is not about getting ready for Passover. It's going to be actually about the obligations of government and spiritual leadership, as we shall see. Katie in Kansas, Alan in New York, Paula in the great Northwest, Ryan in Jacksonville. I'm not sure how to pronounce this. It says JGL. So Jagaloira in Florida. Bill says, love that, by the way. We're all children of the King. It makes up so much of my personal theology and scholarly work. Amen. From Joey Newcomb's song. Nancy in North Carolina. Tom just finished editing his synagogue's own Haggadah. Beautiful. Sandy saying good evening. Melissa congratulating Nina. I'm sorry, what's that? Huget in Las Vegas. Mark in Portland. Paula working so hard. Don in Bahama. Yosef in Massachusetts. Over there on the YouTube side. Gwen in Michigan. And Jacob in Charlotte. Welcome, everybody. Okay, where are we holding? This is Daf Gimel, page 3. Here in Tractate Shekalim, the 5th volume of the Talmud, dealing with the laws of basically the administration and finances of the Holy Temple when it stood in Jerusalem. And this covers some of the obligations that, so there was no church separation of church and state per se, right? There was a separation of government in ancient Israel, right? So there was the king who was essentially the secular government, although bound, of course, by the Torah and the laws of God, and the priests who are running the temple and are in charge of the spiritual life of the nation. So this is not regarding the obligations of the king. This is the obligation of that spiritual leadership of the nation. However, there are things that they're going to have to do to make sure that they're protecting the people, as it were, from coming to transgress, whether intentionally or inadvertently, which are going to require a pretty heavy hand, as we'll see tonight, by the priests and the leaders of the people. But because some of those obligations of that spiritual leadership toward the nation could be unpleasant, unsavory, well, even, the priests themselves would become guilty of procrastination. But unlike an earthly government, which sometimes just, memory holds things they don't want to deal with because it's, unpopular or difficult to execute, whatever, and it just ends up, on some desk in some back room in some file cabinet, never gets dealt with. Here, what we're seeing is, well, there might be some unpleasant things, but at the end of the year, they got to get done. Period. End of story. And the end of the year is the Torah year, right? The year for Torah matters, different than the year in celebrating the birthday of the world, right? So Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year when we celebrate the beginning of the year, but that's the birthday of the world. For matters of Torah, the beginning of the year is measured from when we receive the commandment to celebrate the new moons, anticipating that we would leave Egypt and receive the Torah. And so the first of months is Nisan, this month that contains Passover in it. So as we saw yesterday, when they reach Adar, the previous month, the month that contains Purim in it, that's the time when all these things that people have been putting off have to get done. Yesterday, what we saw is they also announced that they start collecting the half-shekel from every adult male Jew, and that's going to fund the operations of the temple for the coming year. But there were other matters that got attended to also. For example, announcing and then checking that farmers and gardeners were not planting diverse kinds in the same field, right? You had to have a certain distance between different kinds of crops. You don't just grow different plants together in terms of crops. And they would actually go and check that out. Likewise, fruit trees, vineyards, you wouldn't grow wheat interspersed with the rows of grapes in a vineyard, etc. That's just prohibited in the Torah. And they would check that out at this time of year. They would also mark the graves. Because, not every cemetery was like properly marked. Sometimes there was just a place where graves, somebody died and they buried him right there. And that needs to be marked so that people don't walk over it, become ritually impure, tameh, and then go on their pilgrimage festival up to Jerusalem and walk inside the temple precinct, because you can't walk into the grounds of the Temple Mount, if you're ritually impure. You got to go through that purification process. And so people wouldn't accidentally become impure. They marked the graves. And that was another one of these obligations, the work of the leadership during Adar, the month of Adar, the last month of the year before we start that new Torah year in Nisan. All right, we're picking it up right at the top of page 3 here in Tractate Shekalim. The Mishna taught that on the 15th of Adar, they repaired the roads that were damaged in the winter. Now that just sounds like the business of a fully secular government. Why is the temple getting involved in that? But also because Jerusalem, both the capital and spiritual center of the nation, and for Passover, you're going to have all the pilgrims coming. They're going to bring their lambs and their goats. They're going to slaughter it on the afternoon before Passover. They're going to have their, dining sites, right? Whether they're going to be indoors or outdoors. All the groups are going to be registered. A lot of people are coming up to Jerusalem, and the roads have to be in decent shape to receive all that traffic. So they start doing that in Adar, right? So they repaired the roads that were damaged in the winter and the streets and the cisterns, right? So they were collecting water during the rainy season, which they would distribute during the summer. But also with all these pilgrims coming, there was going to be water available for them. And they did all that was necessary for the public welfare. The Gemara explains, these are the matters necessary for the public welfare. So public welfare sounds good, but of course the sages, being sages, are going to define what is necessary for the public welfare. So they judge monetary cases, right? So you might think, that you sue somebody for monetary damages because they inflicted some kind of harm on you, whether it was business harm, physical harm. And basically they were not into, court cases that take years to develop and finally come before a judge. Ideally, it should be speedy justice, and if it's been put off for a while, get it done by the end of the year, particularly capital cases and cases that involve the punishment of lashes. And the court also redeems valuations, consecrations of articles for temple or priestly use, and consecrations for temple maintenance or as offerings. So if people wanted to make a gift to the temple, they were going to consecrate property to the temple, or they're going to say, maybe they'll say, I'm just going to give money. I'm going to make a vow that I'm going to give so much money for the upkeep of the temple, or I'm going to donate an animal. Or maybe they're going to say, I'm going to donate the value of an animal, so then that animal needs to be appraised, and then the person would know how much money to give, and the temple could, know how much money to expect. And they give the sota to drink. I'll just read this list, and then we'll come back. And they give the sota to drink, and they burn the red heifer, to use its ashes for the ritual purification of those rendered impure by contact with the dead. And they break the neck of the heifer whose neck is broken. And they pierce the ear of a Hebrew slave. And they render the leper ritually pure. And they remove the locks that were placed over the water cisterns during the winter, as this water was for public use in the summer, and they do not replace them until the winter. Okay, so let's just go through that list. So these are the matters that are important for the public welfare, and also the tasks that, that could sort of fall between the cracks because they were unpleasant to do and nobody was in a hurry to do them. But now, in the last month of the year, it's time to get it done. Okay, so they give the sota to drink. This is the ordeal of the suspected wife. This would only come up in a situation and only when the temple was standing. This hasn't happened in thousands of years. But if there was a situation where a wife had been secluded with a man who was not her husband, and the husband became aware of it and said to her in the presence of witnesses, do not seclude yourself with that man again. And then she did seclude herself with that man, so then she would be suspected of adultery. If she denies that she committed adultery, but the husband accuses her of it based on the fact that he warned her in the presence of witnesses, and then she secluded herself again, then that married couple are become prohibited to each other until the two of them, with chaperones, go all the way to the Jerusalem, go to the temple, and she goes through the ordeal of drinking the waters of the sota, which is just water in which the verse that describes this law in the Torah is written on a parchment, and then it's dissolved in the water along with some dirt from the ground in the temple. And she drinks the water. If she's guilty, it will kill her. If she's innocent, then she's proven that she's innocent. And not only that, but if she wasn't fertile before, now she will be fertile, and the couple will have children. Very strange and interesting ritual that we're not going to really talk about tonight. We'll come to it in our journey through the Talmud. Burning the red heifer, as we've talked about, when people become impure through touching a corpse, for example, they need to go through a purification process that includes being sprinkled by the waters of the red heifer. There were only 9 red heifers in all of Jewish history, or at least the history when the temple was standing, when this was relevant and possible. And this was a cow that was pure red, or really like a brownish, a reddish brown. But a pure color, no mottling or spots at all, and that has never been worked. And then they would kill it, burn it, and its ashes would be stored very safely. They would mix some of those ashes with the water, and that becomes the water of purification. Breaking the neck of the heifer whose neck is broken is when a body is found kind of like out in the country, and no one knows, who killed this person. And so they measure the distance to the 2 closest towns, and the elders of the town that is closest come out and perform this ritual where they say, we don't know who killed this person. It was not anyone from our town. They break the neck of this heifer that also has not been worked, and they bury the person, dispose of the heifer. And it's a real sad day for everybody that, somebody was murdered and the body was found totally unattended. Piercing the ear of the Hebrew slave. This would be, so if a Canaanite slave would be a slave the way we understand slaves, a Jewish slave would be more like an indentured servant. And after 6 years, he goes out, and he goes out. He probably became a slave because he got himself into debt and couldn't pay. He serves for the 6 years, and then he goes free, and the master actually gives him some money so that he doesn't go out empty-handed. But sometimes a slave got used to living in that house and working with that family, and maybe he even started his own family while he was there, kind of a large household, and maybe he chooses to remain a slave. So then there's a ritual for that where they put his ear up against a doorpost and kind of pierce his ear. And then he'll remain a slave. It's still not forever. It's until the next Jubilee, which comes every 50 years, or I think until the king or the high priest dies. Until the master dies, and then he would go free. So they do these kinds of rituals. Also, rendering the leper ritually pure. A leper is not a leper like leprosy like we know now. We're talking about somebody with tzara'as, that physical manifestation of a spiritual malady with a complicated purification process. And if they hadn't got it done yet, they get it done now. And they remove the locks over the water cisterns that are gathering water during the rainy season, and no one can get at them. But now that the rainy season is over, they open those up with the pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. We learned in a baraisa there that although it is prohibited to perform unnecessary work on the intermediate days of a festival, so that's Chol HaMoed, right? So imagine now in Israel, Passover, it's a 7-day festival. The first day is a full festival. No work can be done, just like Shabbos, except for cooking, specifically for the needs of that day, the festival day. And the 7th day of Passover is a full-fledged festival day. No work may be done except for cooking. The intermediate days are called Chol HaMoed. And on those days, you're still having a festival. Of course, you can't eat any leavened bread, and you should have a festive meal every day. But you can do certain kinds of work. And here the sages are defining that a little bit. That although it is prohibited to perform unnecessary work on the intermediate days of a festival, during these days one may water an irrigated field, and one may mark the graves by painting lime on them. And the Gemara asks, but didn't the court already mark the graves in the month of Adar, as stated in the Mishna here? Why was it necessary to mark them again during the intermediate days of the festival? And the Gemara answers, it can be explained as referring to a situation where a downpour rained down after the graves were initially marked in Adar and washed away the previous markings. The Gemara asks, from where is the obligation of marking graves derived? Rabbi Berekia said, in the name of Rabbi Yaakov bar Bat Yaakov, in the name of Rabbi Chonya of Berat Chavrin, Rabbi Yosei said it was Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha in the name of Rabbi Chonya of Berat Chavrin, while Rabbi Chizkiah and Rabbi Uziel, the son of Rabbi Chonya of Berat Chavrin, said in the name of Rabbi Chonya of Berat Chavrin. And you see, we start to hear some different names. As I mentioned yesterday, this tractate, Shekalim, is not part of the Babylonian Talmud, though it is included in the Daf Yomi cycle that is taken from the Jerusalem Talmud. And so it cites a little bit different names. It's many the same, of course, but some different names. And the rhythm and speech is a little different. It's also sort of numbered a little bit different. So you might hear some of these differences between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud as we proceed. So anyway, these sages who are now deriving the law of how do we know we're obligated to mark graves so that people don't become tameh by walking over a grave, an unmarked grave. These sages said that the proof is from a verse, and the leper in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent, and the hair of his head shall go loose, and he shall cover his upper lip, and he shall cry, Tameh, Tameh, unclean. So that again, that's the spiritual type of leprosy, right? The tzara'as. And when somebody had that, we read that already, even when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness and this law was received. So if somebody became tameh by reason of tzara'as, they're supposed to go outside of the camp, be isolated for a while, have a time to reflect. Often tzara'as associated with lashon hara, speaking with an evil tongue about other people, leads you to have this malady. So he has some time to reflect on how he came to that condition. And if he should happen to walk by people, so he has to socially distance and let them know that he has tzara'as. It's not a virus. A mask isn't going to help. But he has to, socially distance so they don't physically touch him, which is what would be the problem. Then they would become tameh also. And he has to let them know why he's keeping a distance by saying, I'm tameh, I'm impure. And so likewise, these graves, which could cause a person to become tameh, ritually impure, should be marked for the same reason. We skip down to the next Mishna here in chapter 1. Because this Jerusalem Talmud, it doesn't just say Mishna, they're numbering the halachas, the laws. So, right, in my book it says halacha number 2, Mishna, right? So I could call it the second Mishna, but it's the Jerusalem Talmud, so it's the second halacha. At the end of the last Mishnah, it was stated that the court sends out agents on the 15th of Adar to inspect whether the owners of fields had indeed uprooted any diverse kinds of crops that were growing together in the field without the proper distancing between them, as instructed. Rabbi Yehuda said, at first, those agents would uproot the diverse kinds of crops and cast them in front of the owners of the fields. And when the number of transgressors who would not uproot diverse kinds in their fields increased, and the sages saw that this tactic was ineffective, well, they would cast the uprooted crops onto the roads. Ultimately, they instituted that the entire field should be declared ownerless. Right? So this is a case where the government, as it were, the leadership, passed a law to curb a behavior that is a transgression, and it didn't really work very well. So they made the law stiffer, and it didn't work. And then they brought down the heavy hand of the government. And let's read about that. With regard to what Rabbi Yehuda said in the Mishnah, i.e. that there were 3 stages of the sage's decree, the Gemara elaborates as it was taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda said, at first, the agents of the court would uproot, and again, this is a rabbinic court, right? This is the only courts were rabbinic courts, but these are the agents of a rabbinic court, would uproot the diverse kinds of crops and cast them in front of the owners. And these owners would doubly rejoice. One reason for their happiness was that the agents were weeding their fields for them. And the other reason was that they would derive benefit from these diverse kinds, which they would feed to their animals. So it's like the agents of the court came and said, you can't plant wheat in the middle of your vineyard. So they started pulling the wheat out, the wheat stalks. And these people are like, great, I don't have to do it myself. The agents of the court are doing it, and now I can feed that hay, or those stalks to my horses and sheep or whatever. And the Baraisa continues, well, when the number of transgressors who maintained diverse kinds in their fields increased, well, then they started casting the uprooted crops onto the roads so that the passers-by should trample them and render them unfit for any use. Now they can no longer feed it to their animals. Even so, the owners still rejoiced that these agents were weeding their fields for them. Therefore, the sages instituted that the entire field should be declared ownerless, which would deter people from maintaining diverse kinds in their fields. Right? So the whole point was so that to help these people who own the fields so that they will not be guilty of the transgression, a Torah law, a Torah transgression of growing diverse kinds in their fields. So since, pulling it out for them or telling them to pull it out didn't work, pulling it out for them didn't work. So now they're bringing the heavy hand and they're going to say, okay, well, if you are not going to make sure there's no diverse kinds growing in your fields, so then we're going to say that you don't own your field. That way you won't be guilty of that transgression anymore since nobody owns the field. Now, I was wondering when I read that, does that mean that it's largely symbolic? Like it's ownerless, but it's not like somebody can come along and just claim the field. When something is ownerless, it can be claimed. So did it mean that? Or are they really saying we're going to take it away from you and now your neighbors can come in and just take the field for themselves? The halach on this, property declared ownerless by the court is ownerless. It's not just symbolic. A judge, a rabbinic judge, has the power both to declare the property ownerless and to dispose of or transfer it to someone else as he sees fit for the purpose of correcting a widespread error or addressing an important matter. This ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak. So that's where the halacha, the law ends up. Just reading the case, the Gemara asks, from where is it derived that property declared ownerless by the court is in fact ownerless? As the Mishna states that the court rendered the fields ownerless, clearly they had the power to do so. What is the source for their having this power? And the Gemara answers, as it is written with regard to the proclamation of Ezra, right? So Ezra, who led the returnees after the Babylonian exile, and was there as they were getting it together to rebuild the temple and create the second temple. And so the proclamation of Ezra and his court to all the people to gather in Jerusalem, where he instructed those who had married foreign women, non-Jewish women, to divorce them. That's what they did when the Babylonian exiles came back to Israel, and the sort of level, the Torah observance level of the people had fallen dangerously low. And he said, all right, well, the people that are coming back, you can only be married, Jewish men have to be married to Jewish women and producing Jewish children. And so the ones who agreed to come back divorced their Babylonian wives. Where is it? So he made this decree. And so Ezra chapter 10, verse 8, and that whosoever came not within 3 days, according to the counsel of the princes and the elders, all his substance should be forfeited and himself separated from the congregation of the captivity. This shows that the court has the power to render ownerless the property of anyone who violates its commands. Now you might say that weren't those maybe emergency times requiring emergency measures? But now the sages are saying, well, from the fact that Ezra at that time, that extraordinary time in history, said that the court had the power to seize fields, so then the court retained that power. It's a good lesson. Very often you have to be careful about government overreach during times of emergency, that the government then retains that power forever. The Gemara further asks, from where is it derived that this ownerless field is exempt from tithes? Once the court declares your field ownerless because you are growing diverse kinds in there and refuse to end that transgression, now that it's ownerless, so why would you have to tithe it? It's no longer yours, right? So any produce that comes out of that field, you don't have to tithe it, probably, right? That's the question that's being asked. From where is it derived that ownerless fields are exempt from tithes, like a field rendered ownerless by its owner? You can always make your own field ownerless. Sometimes you just do that as a temporary matter for various reasons. Rabbi Yonasan said, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Acha, learned this halacha of this case from a baraisa. One may not intercalate the year by adding the month of second Adar, neither in the sabbatical year, right? Every 7 years, they would not plant any crops. They would let the land rest, which is what the Torah demands, nor in the year after the sabbatical year. And if they transgressed and intercalated it, if they added that leap month, that extra month, which keeps the lunar year in sync with the solar year, if they did, they're not supposed to add that month, neither in the sabbatical year nor the year after the sabbatical year. But if they did add that month, if the Sanhedrin did add that month, it stays, right? So they shouldn't do it, but if they did it, they're the Sanhedrin and it remains an intercalated year. Rabbi Yonasan explains how exemption from tithes of a field that was declared ownerless by the court can be derived from this baraisa about intercalating, adding the leap month in a sabbatical and post-sabbatical year. And yet, with regard to that 1 month that he adds, that the court adds, i.e. the month to intercalate the year, which is added to the sabbatical year, aren't the crops harvested in that additional month exempt from tithes? These crops are sabbatical produce and as such exempt from tithes. But that status is only a result of the decree of the court to extend the year. This proves that the court has the power to render the field exempt from tithes, meaning if they add a month to the year, right, then Rosh Hashanah is going to end up being a month later, right? So when we come out of that year, out of that sabbatical year, we're going to come out of it later. And during that extra month that wouldn't have been part of the sabbatical year otherwise, nobody can use that produce. You can't till, you can't farm that field. And of course, you don't have to tithe anything that comes from it. And that's a result of the action of the court in adding the leap month. So the Gemara continues to analyze the baraisa. Until here, it is clear why the sabbatical year should not be intercalated, as it extends the prohibitions of the sabbatical year. However, what is the reason that the year after the sabbatical year should not be intercalated, that they shouldn't add that leap month in the year after the leap year? Rabbi Boone said, or Rabbi Boone, the reason is so as not to increase the period of the prohibition of new grain. In the year after the 7th year, people are still relying on the produce of the 6th year, right? God said, if you follow my laws, then, this 7-year cycle where every 7th year you don't farm the land, you'll be okay, because in the 6th year, I'm going to give you a bumper crop and you'll have plenty to eat. Not only in at the end of the 6th year, but in the 7th year as well. Okay, so you're relying on that 6th year produce all through the 7th year and all into the 8th year until we're allowed to start eating the new produce. But if you add that month, it's just 1 month later until we can start using the new produce. In the year after the 7th year, people are still relying on the produce of the 6th year until the new crop sprouts in the spring of the 8th year. Since the food supply is liable to run out, the sooner the new grain can be eaten, the better. It is only permitted after the bringing of the Omer offering, which is on the 2nd day of Passover. That's when we can start eating the barley crop. That's when we bring the barley offering and we can start eating the new grain of that year. in the 16th of Nisan, and therefore it is preferable not to extend the year, which would delay the beginning of Nisan. Rabbi Zera says, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, that which you say, that one may not intercalate the sabbatical year or the following year, only applied until the time that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi permitted one to import vegetables from outside of Eretz Yisrael, outside the land of Israel, into Israel. Beforehand, there was a danger of insufficient food, and the court needed to refrain from lengthening either the sabbatical year or the year after. However, from the time when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi permitted one to import vegetables, to import food from outside the land, so even though they couldn't farm their fields in the 7th year, there wasn't the danger of a shortage of food because they could import food and buy it and eat it, so there was no danger of the people starving. Prior to that, I guess they were saying you couldn't bring in food to the land of Israel, that the kingdom of Israel was self-sufficient, as it were. Okay, so once he had permitted that, then there was enough food for the sabbatical year and all the other years of the sabbatical cycle. It was permitted to add a leap month. Okay, we jump down now to halacha number 3, the third Mishnah. We're near the top of the B side of Daf Gimel, page 3, here in Tractate Shekalim. On the 15th of Adar, halfway through the month of Adar, which is when we're right after Purim, the money changers would sit at tables set up in the rest of the country outside the temple to handle the collection of the shekels. Remember, this is Tractate Shekalim, and really the topic that we're discussing is when and how they would collect the half-shekel from every adult Jewish male, which would be used to fund the operations of the temple all year. So on the 15th of Adar, on the 1st of Adar, they would announce, you have to bring your half-shekel, bring your half-shekel. On the 15th of the month, they would sit at tables that were set up around the country, outside the temple, to handle the collection of the shekels. On the 25th of Adar, the money changers sat in the temple, and from the time when the money changers sat in the temple, the court began to seize collateral from those who had not yet donated their half shekel. It was a donation, but it was a mandatory donation. So they would set up these tables where there was a box with what's called a horn, kind of like a tube on top, so people couldn't stick their hand into the shekel box. They would just drop their coins in it. Now, these people called money changers, why money changers? Wouldn't it be more accurate to call them shekel collectors or even tax collectors or donation collectors? And the reason they're called money changers is because there wasn't such a standardized money, right? There was lots of different kinds of money being used in that part of the world. And what you had to donate was what was considered in that year, in the particular year that we're talking about, a half shekel, something that amounted to the half shekel. But there wasn't always, the kingdom of Israel issuing money in the denomination of a half shekel. People were bringing money from, and they were collecting it, remember, not just in Israel, but from the Jewish community throughout the world. So wherever people were, they had to bring money equivalent to the half shekel. And sometimes they had more than they needed, but they needed to donate what was considered in any given year the amount of silver that a half shekel would have as defined by the sages. And so these money changers were performing a public service. Okay, and so why is it that on the 25th of Adar, it was like, on the 15th, they put out the money boxes, and 10 days later, if you haven't donated, now the court has a right to seize collateral and coerce you, to force you to pay your half shekel. Why was the 25th significant? Because Adar has 29 days. On the 25th, you've got 4 days to go, and that's when they need to start selecting the lambs for the communal offerings. I mean, there's a daily offering, There's a daily sacrifice when the temple is standing, and anything that's going to be an offering on behalf of or any offering that's going to go up on the altar, it has to be an unblemished animal. And to make sure that it's unblemished, they have to observe it for 4 days. And so on the 25th, they would start observing the new animals that are going to be starting to be purchased on the 1st of Nisan. So that's why the 25th of Adar is significant. From whom did they seize collateral, right? So people who didn't, adult Jewish males who didn't pay their half shekel when asked, and they were going to take collateral, from whom would they seize such a collateral? Well, from everybody, right? Except that there was one group who was treated special. From whom did they seize collateral? From Levites, from Israelites, from converts, from emancipated slaves. However, they did not seize collateral from women, slaves, or minors because they were not responsible. Women were not obligated to pay the half shekel. Slaves and minors were not obligated in their own half shekel. Their parent or their owner would be obligated for that on their behalf. And in fact, a minor is not obligated to donate the half shekel. You only become obligated in the half shekel when you're 20 years old. But if a father starts paying the half shekel on behalf of his minor son, then he's already established that that's what's going to be done, and he has to keep doing it year after year. The Mishnah goes on to, and here's the point about this special exception. The court does not seize the collateral from priests. Although they are legally obligated to give a half shekel like other Jews, they wouldn't coerce them to give the half shekel by seizing their collateral. Why? Darchei shalom. These are the ways of peace. Because the priests are already volunteering and bringing the offerings on behalf of the nation. They do get special treatment. They're obligated to give the half shekel, but they don't get coerced like other people. Presumably the priests, in order to serve in the temple, already have a much, much greater Torah education than the average person, and they would know better than to not give their half shekel, and they should have the means to do it as well, as since they were sort of like a prominent class of people. Even though they weren't given land in Israel, they had businesses, and they would usually do pretty well. They were generally, kind of like upper middle class and above. But they would give up the income from their work for 2 weeks each year when they would go serve in the temple. And because because they were making that sacrifice, they were treated a little bit different than the other people. The Mishnah goes on to explain the status of priests with regard to the contribution of the half shekel. Rabbi Yehuda said that Ben Bukri testified in Yavne, where the yeshiva was in Yavne. Any priest who contributes the half shekel is not considered a sinner, meaning that according to Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Ben Bukri, the priests are permitted to donate the half shekel, but not obligated. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said to Ben Bukri, not so. Rather, any priest who does not contribute the half shekel is a sinner, meaning that the priests are obligated just like everyone else. However, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai continued, the priests who do not contribute interpret this verse to their own advantage, and citing Leviticus 6:16, and every meal offering of the priest shall be wholly made to smoke, it shall not be eaten. Meaning that the priests would claim like this: since the Omer offering, a meal offering, and the 2 loaves, i.e. the public offering of 2 loaves from the new wheat brought on the festival of Shavuos, and the showbread placed on the sacred temple in the sanctuary, which is removed and eaten by the priests every Shabbos, which are all meal offerings, are ours. They belong to the priests. So then if they would contribute shekels like everybody else, then they might have partial ownership of these offerings that they're supposed to eat on behalf of the nation. And if they did have partial ownership, that would actually disqualify them from eating it because they're not supposed to own those offerings. They're supposed to belong to the nation. How then can they be eaten? They ought to be regarded as priest meal offerings, which must be wholly burnt and not eaten. But since these offerings are eaten, the priests concluded, in their own kind of logic, that they are not obligated to contribute the half shekel. This argument does not, however, take into account the fact that communal offerings belong to the public, which is understood as its own entity, and are not regarded as shared offerings of all who contribute to the public purse, meaning everyone who gave the half shekel. So it was a bad argument that the priests might bring. They had no foot to stand on, no leg to stand on. The priests were, and the halacha follows Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the priests were obligated, like everyone else, to give the half shekel, but they weren't coerced like other people because of what they already were involved in their service of the temple. The Gemara on this, skip down a couple of lines. The Mishna taught that no collateral is taken from priests because of the ways of peace. The Gemara adds that this is how the halacha of this Mishnah is taught in a baraisa. One may not seize collateral from priests because of the way of honor. So a different term than the way of peace. I.e., priests must be treated with respect. They're invested, right, with the dignity of the priesthood to serve on behalf of the nation. And this is also the meaning of the ways of peace mentioned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah further taught that Rabbi Yehuda said that Ben Bukhri testified that any priest who contributes the half shekel is not considered a sinner, to which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai retorted that any priest who does not contribute is a sinner. Rabbi Berechia said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's source is the following verse. This is Exodus 30:13. This, zeh, the Hebrew word zeh, this they shall give. This they shall give. Everyone who passes among them that are numbered, half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary. The word zeh has a numerical value of 12. The gematria of the word zeh is 12, from which it is derived, 12 tribes shall give. This includes the tribe of Levi, of which the priests are a subgroup of the tribe of Levi, and so they and the Levites, all of them, are included in the obligation to give the half shekel. The Gemara notes, and now I'm almost done. I'm skipping to near the end of the page, so if you've got questions or comments, get them in now. The Gemara notes that there is another dispute of Tanaim along the same lines as this one. It is written, this they shall give everyone who passes among them that are numbered half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah disputed the meaning of this verse. One of them said that the verse means all who passed through the Red Sea must give a half shekel. In other words, the whole Jewish people. And the other said that all who passed before Moses, to be numbered when he took the census of the people, they must give the donation of the half shekel. This does not include the Levites because the Levites had their own census. They were counted separately by God's command. And so according to that interpretation, the Levites and the priests are not obligated in the half shekel, but as we've said, the halacha follows Yochanan ben Zakkai that they are obligated. And the Gemara comments, the one who said that all who pass through the Red Sea must give a half shekel supports the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and the one who maintains that the priest must, he maintains that the priest must also contribute, whereas the one who said that all who passed to be numbered must give the donation supports the opinion of Ben Bukhri. Okay, that's what I have for us today. Let me check your comments and questions. Here we go. Sharon. A huge part of the rededication of Jewish cemeteries in Poland, where there are no longer any Jews, is to properly identify where the graves are, especially since Matzevot were damaged or missing, meaning the gravestones, not only to prevent becoming tameh, but to prevent desecration of the deceased as well. Absolutely right. So when the temple is not standing, we actually assume that everyone in the world is tameh, right? Well, first of all, it doesn't apply to non-Jews. Non-Jews cannot become impure. These laws only apply to Jews. But it is assumed that we are all in a state of tuma because we don't know where the graves are in the world. Who knows what we're walking over? Who knows what we're touching? People aren't enforcing these laws of tahara, except in terms of family purity, between husbands and wives, and that they're prohibited to each other during the wife's menses. And then she immerses in the mikveh, so they become permitted to each other again. But in terms of tuma from touching, the carcasses of creeping things, or corpse tuma, or walking over a grave, etc., we're just all of us assumed to be in a state of tuma. However, Kohanim, people who, men who are Kohens, the descendants of Aaron, you know that you are, if your father told you that you are, they do avoid walking into a cemetery unless they are burying their own family. Now what Sharon is addressing is that during the Holocaust, so many Jewish cemeteries in Poland, in Russia, Ukraine, etc., Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary were just utterly desecrated. Stones were taken off. There was a haunting image in Schindler's List where they paved a road with Jewish headstones. I've gone, twice to Ukraine to spend Rosh Hashanah in Uman, and we visited some cemeteries. And very often you see how the local anti-Semites desecrated these cemeteries many times, and knocked over the stones, broke the stones. So there's so many unmarked graves in those cemeteries. It's tragic. And just for the dignity of the people who are buried there are societies that are trying to restore those cemeteries, and we honor their work. Bill, a very wise and important point about the state retaining power granted to it in emergencies. For this reason, we should always be skeptical of claims by the powerful that solutions can only be arrived at by making them more powerful, since power is rarely, if ever, temporary. Exactly, just so. And I remember when I was in law school, the very important phrase to describe how this can also happen in terms of laws being passed, tough cases make bad law, right? So sometimes you have a tough case, you have a really difficult situation, the equity, the unfairness, the emotion of it leads people to want to quickly pass laws. But those laws, outside of this one particular case can cause their own mega problems down the road. So something to remember, tough cases make bad law. Lucy, what is meant by seizing collateral? Did they forcibly take goods or money equivalent to the half-shekel from the people? It's a great question. I'm not sure. A half-shekel is not a lot of money. It's a small amount of money. I think the idea was that they had the power to seize collateral. And who knows, maybe they would even just say to a person, we're going to take your hat until you give us the half-shekel. There definitely was the understanding, and it was asked yesterday, I don't know that there definitely was, but it seems to me that if people were so indigent that they weren't going to eat, they weren't going after those people in such a harsh way. Everyone is obligated to bring the half-shekel, but not everybody brought it. But it's certainly in the case that people could afford it, they were saying you got to give. You got to give. The well-being of the nation, as expressed through the communal offerings that are brought every day in the temple, requires that everybody give. Yosef, on yesterday's daf, at the close of Pesachim, at the end of our trip through Pesachim, and remember that Thursday we're going to make the actual siyum and cover the final Mishna of Tractate Pesachim. That's going to be at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. Special show, and that's going to excuse the first, when we make that celebration on completing Tractate Pesachim, those who are obligated to fast, firstborns, on the fast of the firstborn, which is observed on Thursday, by joining in the celebration of finishing a course of study through a tractate, you can then make a l'chaim and have a snack, and then you don't have to fast the rest of the day. So we're doing that Thursday morning. But Yosef says, on yesterday's daf at the close of Pesachim, you mentioned that Moses told Pharaoh that they must go worship in the desert that was the initial request, right? Not free my people from slavery immediately. It was, we all need to go into the desert for 3 days to worship God and to bring our animals with us so we can make offerings. Does that have anything to do with the giving of these offerings spoken about here? And you also mentioned it was not permitted to do it in Mitzrayim because of idolatry. Right, so it's interesting. They never made a trip the way that Moses originally asked, because Pharaoh kept hardening his heart, and Moses, at God's command, kept doubling down and sort of increasing the request. In the beginning, it was like, we're all going to go out and we're going to just go there for a few days with our animals and give offerings. And then Pharaoh said, no, you can't go. And then, the plagues came, and toward the end, it's like, no, you're going to let my people go. We're all going to leave, all of us, the men, the women, the children, the old people, the young, with all our livestock, etc., because we don't know what animals we'll have to offer till we get there. And ultimately, of course, it was almost like a negotiation, but whatever offerings Moses was referencing, I guess, yes, we ultimately made our offerings. Right, so what offerings were they? Well, we didn't start making offerings until we got out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, came to Mount Sinai, received the Torah, and then created the tabernacle. So that's like a year later, and all of its accessories, including the altar and the vessels, and anointed and initiated the priests who would bring the offerings. And then we finally started making offerings according to Torah law. But we didn't know, there had already been a tradition of making offerings. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob made offerings according to the traditions that they had. But the idea of bringing offerings as defined in the Torah, we couldn't do until the Torah was given, right? So those came later. And why couldn't we do them in Egypt? Because remember, what did we actually slaughter in Egypt? One offering we did do in Egypt before we even left, and that was the Passover offering, the Pesach. And that was either a lamb or a goat. Was the goat an option at the first Pesach? I'm not sure offhand. I think it probably was, but I'm not sure. But I know that the sheep was an animal that the Egyptians worshipped. So the idea that they would, slaughter a sheep in full view of the Egyptians was like incredibly provocative. But of course, by that point, we were on to the 10th plague, and the Egyptians were in no position to contest that the Jews would bring their offering on the night of the first Passover. Finally, Elvis, question: was it acceptable for wealthier people to voluntarily give more than a half shekel at this occasion, or was it limited to a half shekel so that everyone was on the same level? Fantastic question. It's going to be answered when we get to page 6, which is the page for Saturday. We're a little bit ahead, so we'll come to it on Friday. And that question comes up. Everyone is obligated to give a half shekel. That is the donation of the half shekel. Could you give more to the temple? Absolutely. At any time, you could make a donation to the temple. There's lots of different kinds of donations to the temple that you could make. But one question that will come up is, well, for example, what if you were saving up with little coins until you reached the value of a half shekel and you were putting coins in a box, right? And then eventually when you open the box, you realize you had more than the equivalent of a half silver shekel. So do all the coins in that box have to be given to the temple because you put them in with the idea that they would be for a donation to the temple? Or is it only, the half shekel's worth that is given to the temple, and the rest is yours to keep, and it has not become consecrated? That's going to be the subject of a dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, and we'll come to that on Friday with God's help. That's what I've got for us today. May you be blessed to have meaning and joy in your Passover preparation, if you're preparing for Passover. And if not, may you be blessed to have meaning and joy in all your ways. All the best, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow.